Hi everybody, welcome to the second section of the Information Retrieval Lab. This week we're going to cover four main learning objectives. These include learning to build queries using commands like the select and delete commands. You won't actually be typing them in and using the actual code within SQL, but more or less the same thing will be done within Access. You'll also learn to specify criteria to structure your queries. So, for example, let's say you're looking for the word cat, but not Catwoman. If you just type in cat, sometimes that'll bring in any derivative of that depending on how it's structured. We're basically going to show you how to narrow your searches just doing different parameters like that. We're going to teach you how to manipulate data sets without data entry, or at least get into the basics of it. And we're going to further explore complex database and table structures. This section of the lab is going to be a little more in-depth than the previous one. Less data entry, less focus on data normalization, and definitely less working back and forth with classmates. Fewer files that you're going to have to save. You're just going to only have to save it in one, but there's going to be an equal amount of work. As far as the reading lab goes, obviously, or the reading for this section of the lab goes, there's obviously the YouTube channel, which if you're watching this, you're already at. And then there's also an appendix from Office 2010, the missing manual, and the link you'll find right here on the screen. Basically, what you can do is you can just visit this, and it provides a very, very good overview of the query construction process. So this is actually going to be something that I would suggest you browse through. Some of you may be able to get away with it, but if you're new to Access, and definitely if you're new to database queries, if you're new to SQL, or if you haven't even heard of it before this class or anything like this, it'll kind of give you a good introduction to everything. Don't read it verbatim, just skim through, but it's a good way to get an idea of how Office, and more specifically Access, helps you go about querying and returning sets of information in a relational database. So, like always, like I said last time, if you're having help, just go ahead and contact me, AJ Million, or you can get a hold of somebody at the Digital Media Zone at zone.missouri.edu. We'll be here to help you. This section is going to be, as I said earlier, a little more in-depth, so I wouldn't be surprised if some problems come up. That said, we'll help you out. No need to worry about it too much, and the goal here is to make you learn, to help you get comfortable with the activity that a relational database carries out behind the scenes. So let's just jump right into it then. For this section, by now you've already created and saved a file named group database or something analogous to that in the course Dropbox folder. And for this part of the IR lab, we're going to manipulate this same database and the data contained within its table. Now, we're going to do this using the make table, select, update, delete, and other commands. And you're not required to memorize and use these queries in the traditional sense. They are indicative of the commands executed within a relational database. So we have this pretty screen in front of us. We click on buttons that say maybe return or delete, and they're very simplified. What a graphical user interface does is when you click on these buttons, it essentially tells the computer to run these commands behind the scenes. Just because you see things visually doesn't mean that the computer's looking at it in only that sense. So that's the best way I can describe this. So kind of just going off of that, database administrators manipulate huge sets of data, which makes data management difficult. As a case in point, I think we have maybe 100 or 200 records within our little prototype library catalog. But if you get into a really large catalog, say like, I don't know, the Merlin cluster, which is the University of Missouri's cluster within Mobius, you're going to have, what, probably millions of records? Well, if you have that much stuff in there, you don't have time to go in and manually edit and change everything. That's why we have commands within a relational database, because it's much more powerful. There are ways to batch edit things all at once, and it's a lot easier. Moreover, database queries not only can return stuff on the front end to end users, but they can also be used behind the scenes to identify relevant records and also expedite the data curation process. So the real cool thing here is, let's say you're a cataloger, or let's say you're just a web developer or a database administrator, and you want to change a bunch of records for a database for all these books that you have. But you don't have time to go back and spend, you know, however much time you did before going through and changing each item individually. Well, that's when structured query languages like SQL in relation to a relational database come in great, because you can tell a computer, I want to select only these records within this parameter and I want you to automatically do X, Y, and Z to it. So that's kind of what we're going to cover here today. So what are these queries and what do they look like? So, as I mentioned earlier, some of this is covered in Office 2010, the missing manual, but I've taken the liberty of creating just a brief table outlining what these access queries are. These are the basic commands that are provided within Access. So if we skim down here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. They are the select query. You have an example of some of the raw code over here on the right, which you don't need to worry about. Select lets you create subsets of data to answer questions and can supply data to database objects. The parameter queries, which are effectively subsets of most other ones, and allows you to run variations of something. The total query, which allows you to group and summarize numerical data. The crosstab query, the make table query, the append query, the update query, and the delete query. Now, all of these do different things, and they're the building blocks, so to speak, of how a behind-the-scenes relational database works. If you can master these basic abilities, these basic commands, then effectively you have a database that works, that can take, store, manipulate, and edit information and records behind the scenes however you want. And that's what we're going to get into today. You would think there'd be more commands than that, but there's no real need to. Those basic elements are the things that underpin any relational database. So, now, I want to add one quick warning. We don't cover every command that a relational database uses in this unit. Databases regardless of the type, and there are more than just one. Access is one program that does it. MySQL is another really common one I think I mentioned last time, and there's several other different types of databases that can be run on the web. Regardless of what type they use, they're more often than not going to use a what's called structured query language. So you might see the term SQL out there. More information is available online on Wikipedia. I have an article here if you just want to skim through and just learn a little more about it. But essentially, what a structured query language does is it's a special type of language that allows you to write structured queries. So it's a way for you as an end user, either a system developer and or a actual library catalog user, to actually go to a computer and say, I want all these records within these certain parameters. That's all there really is to it. It's the communication language of databases. So, because learning these takes a lot of time, we opted just to cut that out. Hence why we're using Microsoft Access and its graphical user interface. So don't worry too much about learning the actual SQL code itself. If you want to do that in the future, that's great, but it's not necessarily necessary for the purposes of this lab. But the important thing to learn, aside from the idea of the basic commands, is that relational databases use these commands, use a structured language to manipulate and retrieve data. And whether users see them or not, or whether you see them or not, these commands usually, actually not usually, always are going to be text-based. They underpin database operations, and they're how everything goes. They're actually the same reason why sometimes you might see, a really savvy, computer science guy working on, just kind of the black matrix like screen that looks like DOS out of the 80s or something, or even the early 90s, and see somebody just messing around or doing things like that. Well, a lot of the time people still use the command line because that's what underpins a lot of graphical programs. And in the case of SQL, this is very common, and Access basically is a front end. So, to kind of get back off my tangent here, there are some command-based differences between MS Access and basic SQL code. For example, Access uses the append command, but SQL uses the insert command. This is another reason why we just chose to use Access, so you didn't have to worry about minor differences between different systems. As I said before, we provide a few examples of the code before, and I'll go over and show you that here in a second. But there are many different types of code that you're going to probably come across in your career as an information professional. Um, I'm relatively young, and already I've seen 3 or 4 different pieces of code of very different code types when you include HTML, PHP, all these different languages, most of which underpin or help support web tools. But what really helps, even if you're not editing it or using it or changing anything, it helps to know what they are and know the differences between the two. So if you're ever working with somebody in IT and you need to fix something, well, you're going to be able to speak the language. So you may want to go through and look exactly how structured query languages work, just to get an idea of what they look like compared to, say, HTML or something else. Last of all, queries can be refined using search parameters, which I think has been more or less implicit from everything I've said. Examples of this include Boolean operators, so the use of logic like and or not between search terms. You can have relational operators, so 1 is greater than 2, or 2 is greater than 1, 5 is greater than 2. You can tell the system to return between certain dates, greater than certain dates, less than certain dates, equal to certain dates, and a quick overview is provided here at this link on the Microsoft website. I would highly recommend that you go through and look at this. If you go here, this is the site, you'll see it provides a great list of all these different criterion for exactly how you can structure your queries within Access. You can do a lot of stuff here. It's very powerful, and when you start dealing with 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, maybe even a million records, this sort of stuff is gonna allow you to retrieve certain bits of information that you wouldn't be able to find just going through and looking on your own. So just to go and kind of sum this up before we really get into the unit itself, if you see here under Table 1, under Access Queries, we've got 2 examples of SQL code right here. So this first one is the select code, and you'll see there's the select command followed by the dc underscore database dot title. So dc underscore database is the name of the table, and then dot title is the name of the row, and then basically, if you go over here again, what you do is you see dc underscore database dot subject, so that's another row, from dc underscore database. What this is telling the system to do is to return the title row and the subject row of our table, of our database basically, both at the same time together from the dc underscore database table. That's all it does. It just returns it basically, and it's an easy way to select it. And then another example, and this is a little more complicated here, is the delete code. You see delete and then dc underscore database, which is the table, and then dot format. So we're going to be deleting from the database table and then the database column. And then over here you see from DC database, so it's from the same database where, and then of course the table again, where the column format equals book. So in this case, and it's basic logic here, once you understand exactly how it works, we can basically deduce that the system here is saying, okay, we're going to delete every instance, every row, and I misspoke earlier when I was talking about columns, but every row that contains a book. So if it's a book from this database, and if it's in the format column, it's gone. It deletes it. Well, that's all there is to this. In our next section, we're going to go ahead and move into the actual assignment and some of the different activities that you're going to carry out. I'll walk you through that to make it a little easier for you, and then we will hopefully be able to go from there. All right,